On August 16th, 1879, a man named Anton Sauer was lowered into the ground at Union Cemetery in Kansas City. 32 days earlier, he had to bury his infant daughter Helen in the same plot. The newspaper that ran his obituary did not write "died." It wrote these words instead: "Gone home, at rest in a better world." This is the true story of the hauntings of the Sauer Castle. If you've ever driven through the Argentine neighborhood of Kansas City, Kansas, you've probably seen it without even realizing what you were looking at. A 4-story Italianate mansion with red brick, a square center tower rising above the rooftop, bracketed eaves, and wrought iron everywhere. It looks like it was lifted out of a New England port town and dropped in the Midwest by mistake. And depending on who you ask, it's either one of the most haunted houses in Kansas City, if not America, or it's the single most misunderstood building in Kansas City. It's been featured on paranormal television, listed in haunted Midwest guidebooks, and whispered about by tour guides who've never even stepped foot inside. The stories are wild. A figure in the tower's window, a child's footsteps on the second floor, or a woman who hanged herself from the 3rd floor balcony. Stories of suicides, apparitions, cold spots. Now, some of these stories are true, but most of them are not. And the real story, the one that's buried in cemetery records and German language obituaries from 1879, is somehow more haunting than any of these ghost tales. This is case file number 1, the Sauer Castle, and what I found when I went looking for the truth. Anton Sauer was born in 1826 in what is now Austria. By the time he reached middle age, he had immigrated to America, lost his first wife, and remarried a German immigrant named Marie Messerschmidt. In the late 1860s, Anton was diagnosed with tuberculosis. His doctor told him that the air in the east was killing him. They said he needed to go west and find higher ground. So, he moved his family to Kansas City. In 1869, on a hill that overlooked the Kansas River, he began construction on a house, now known as the Sauer Castle. Not a farmhouse, and definitely not a frontier cabin. A mansion. Italianate style, a fashionable architecture look for the time, all the way from the East Coast, complete with a central tower, ornate porches, and detail work that no other building in the area had. The construction took 2 years. The house was finally finished in 1871. Anton, Marie, and their children moved in. He had a successful business in town. He served on the civic board. He was, by every account, a respected and prosperous man in the early Kansas City days. And then, in the summer of 1879, the house began to break. On July 15th, 1879, Anton and Marie's infant daughter Helen passed away. 32 days later, on August 16th, 1879, Anton Sauer had passed away as well. He was 55 years old. The cause was listed as tuberculosis that he had been fighting for over a decade. But neighbors said it wasn't the disease that killed him. It was Helen. He'd outlived his daughter by 1 month. He could not outlive a second. Anton and baby Helen were buried together at Union Cemetery in Kansas City. The local German language paper, the Kansas City Pioneer, ran his obituary on August 23, 1879. The headline was brief: "Gone home, at rest in a better world." Marie Sauer became a widow at 38 years old, with young children in a house that her husband had built and barely lived in. She did not sell, she did not leave. She stayed in that house for the next 40 years. To understand why the Sauer Castle actually attracted ghost stories, you have to understand what kind of house it actually is. Italianate architecture was popular in America from roughly 1840 to 1885. The style is defined by tall, narrow windows, low-pitched roof with wide bracketed eaves, and most distinctly, a central square tower called a belvedere. The Sauer Castle had all of that. The tower rises a full story above the main roof line. From inside, it offers a view across the Kansas River Valley. From outside, it gives the house its signature silhouette. The silhouette that people now associate with hauntings. Here's the thing about Italianate towers. At night, with one window lit, they look exactly like towers in every haunted house story ever written. The architecture is the trigger, and the lore follows. Anton built this house with 13 rooms, a formal parlor, a grand staircase, servants' quarters in the upper floors. There was stained glass detailing, the kind of construction that in 1871 in Kansas City would have made it the fanciest private home in the area by a wide margin. Here's the part of the Sauer Castle story that almost nobody tells correctly. The property never left the family. Anton built it, and Marie kept it for 40 years after he died. After her death, it was passed down through their descendants, and it stayed inside the Sauer family line ever since. Today, it's owned and lived in by Carl G. Lope, a direct descendant who spent decades restoring it at his own expense. The fact alone reshapes everything. Most haunted house lore in America comes from buildings that sat empty, got chopped into rentals, fell into despair, or passed down through dozens of different owners. The Sauer Castle did none of that. It's been a family home continuously for over 150 years, which makes the question of what people claim to have seen there a little bit more interesting. So here's where the Sauer Castle earned its reputation. Over the past century, dozens of stories have been told about the house. Some have been printed in books. Some got passed around Kansas City paranormal circles, and a few have actually made it on television. Let me walk you through the ones that actually stuck. One story is the tower figure. Multiple witnesses over multiple decades have reported seeing a figure standing in the upper window of the central tower. Sometimes the figure is described as a man in dark Victorian clothing. Sometimes it's described as a woman with long hair and a high collar. The figure is always standing still, it's always watching, and when witnesses look back, the window is empty. Now, some people say it's Anton himself, watching over the house that he barely got to live in. Some say it's Marie, keeping vigil 4 decades after her death. Some say it's neither, that the house has always been a place where something is watching. Perhaps the most repeated story in haunted Kansas guidebooks is that of a woman who was said to have hanged herself in the 3rd floor balcony. In some versions, this is a heartbroken lover. In others, she's a stranger to the family. People claim that they've seen a figure on certain nights when the wind is just right. I will say it's the most cinematic of the Sauer Castle ghost stories. It's the one that, your local tour guides love to tell. According to different reports that I found, there were psychic visits there as well. In the 1990s, a Kansas City psychic named Cindy visited the property and conducted a series of readings. She reported a heavy presence in the tower. She described a man in mourning who never left. She said that the upstairs hallway carried the energy of a child. Believers recite her readings as confirmation, where skeptics point out that she has access to public records before she even walked in. Either way, for a generation of Kansas Cityans, Cindy's visit cemented the Sauer Castle as the most haunted address in the metro. So, those are the stories. The tower figure, the spooky little children ghost, the hanged woman, and psychic visits. They are vivid and a bit unsettling. They've been on repeat in prints, on television, and living rooms across Kansas City for 40 years. There's just one problem. Most of those, they're not even true. So what do the records actually say? For about 40 years, a Kansas City historian named Becky Ray has quietly researched the Sauer Castle. Not to debunk it and not to defend it, just to find out what's actually documented and what isn't. She pulled cemetery records, census data, German language obituaries, property deeds, old newspapers, the actual paper trail of what happened in that house. And here's what she found. Let's go over the hanged woman. There's no record of a woman hanging herself from the third floor balcony. It's not in the Kansas City coroner's record, not in any newspaper archives, and not in the property's history. The story appears to originate from the 1980s, over 100 years after the house was built, and it may have been confused with a different Kansas City suicide that occurred several blocks away. It's the most repeated Sauer Castle ghost story, and the documentary trail for it is empty. Several haunted Kansas books claim that the house has been the site of multiple suicides over its history. But Becky's research found documentation of none of them inside of the building. Anton died of tuberculosis. Marie lived to her 70s and died of natural causes. Subsequent owners did not, by any record that she could find at least, take their own lives in the house. Now for the tower figure, this is the only story that Becky's research could not completely rule out. Witnesses are real, and reports go back for decades, but the figure has never been photographed and never been recorded, not even been corroborated by any forensic evidence. It's the kind of haunting story that lives in the gap between fact or fiction. Becky's research has been generous. She spent 20 years digging into a story that most people are content to repeat without even checking. And her conclusion is probably not one that you would expect. Now, she didn't say that the Sauer Castle isn't haunted. She claims that the haunting that people talk about isn't the one that actually happened there. The real haunting is Anton and Helen, buried 32 days apart in the same plot at Union Cemetery. The real haunting is Marie, alone in a 13-room mansion for 40 years. The real haunting is what grief does to a building when it stays inside the walls long enough. That's the story most people don't tell. Today, the Sauer Castle is owned by Carl G. Loeb, a direct descendant of Anton and Marie. The house stayed in his family since 1871. Now, Carl is not a paranormal investigator, he's not a tour operator, and he's not interested in the house being famous. He spent decades restoring it at his own expense, preserving a piece of his family's history that most haunted content channels treat as a backdrop. In 2015, after years of trespassers, broken windows, urban explorer videos, and ghost hunting groups climbing his fence, Carl Lopp wrote a public Facebook statement asking people to please stop coming to his home. He explained that he had restored the house at his own expense and that the rumors are mostly false. that he and his family have lived there for decades without incident. He asked plainly and publicly for privacy. And here's where I have to be pretty honest with you. Making this video put me in a position of a place that I need to address, because Carl Lope does not want any more attention to this house. He said it publicly, and he said it for years. So if you are watching this and you're tempted to go drive past the Sauer Castle, please don't. If you're tempted to stop and take photos through the fence, please don't. And if you've ever climbed it, knocked on the door, or filmed it without permission, that's a family that you're bothering. Carl Lope is a real person in a real house. The ghost stories are told about his home. They're mostly invented. The exhaustion of being the punchline to other people's haunted Kansas tour is not. So please respect his wishes. I don't want this video to push one more person to his gate. So watch the story, but don't visit the house. There are two versions of the Sauer Castle. There's the one with the stories of the hanged woman or a little boy on the stairs and figure in the tower. The whispered hauntings that have grown bigger every decade since the house stood empty. And then there's the one that actually exists. Built by an immigrant trying to outrun his own lungs, finished 2 years before he had to bury his daughter, and then be buried himself 32 days later. Kept by a widow for 40 years, held by their descendants ever since, and restored today by a man who just wants to be left alone. The first Sauer Castle is more entertaining, the second one more haunted. If you ever stand at Union Cemetery in Kansas City and you look down at the right plot, you'll find Anton's name and Helen's name on the same stone. A man and a baby, 32 days apart, gone home, at rest in a better world. Maybe that's what the figure in the tower actually is. It's not a ghost story. It's a man waiting to be remembered for something other than the rumors people tell about his home. I'm Mr. Frankenstein, and this was my first full case file of digging into haunted locations of Kansas City. And if you like videos like this of me digging into these haunted locations of Kansas City, go ahead and give me a subscribe, because the second case file, it's already sitting on my desk.